You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
This episode contains graphic depictions of violent crimes. Listener discretion is advised.
Mackay is a city on the Coral Sea coast of Queensland, Australia, located about 970 kilometres north of Brisbane. It's known as the sugar capital of Australia, producing more than a third of the country's cane sugar. In South Mackay sits a spacious pub called Harrup Park Country Club. In February 2013, this was one of the last places Shandee Blackburn would be seen alive. The 23-year-old finishes her 7-hour Friday night shift and begins to make her way home to her mother's house in Boddington Street. Wearing dark pants and a dark shirt, Shandee taps out a text message as she walks, not even 15 minutes from her destination. It's warm outside with a light breeze as the town enters into its last weeks of summer. The streets are quiet, empty. Shandee has no reason to be afraid. But that night, Shandee will not make it to her front door. A taxi driver would see a scuffle he does not understand and calls the police.
A person was hit by another person.
Like a driving a vehicle, or are they having a fight?
No, they're having a fight, but someone grabbed the bag from the lady and hit the lady. I think the lady is in critical condition, so need emergency.
Okay, roger that.
She is brutally attacked, and CCTV footage features a man, just prior to her attack, crouching in some nearby bushes. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In today's episode, I'm speaking with investigative journalist Hedley Thomas. Hedley writes for the Australian newspaper and has appeared on True Crime Conversations before to discuss his podcast, The Night Driver. Most recently, Hedley has been investigating the unsolved murder of Shandee Blackburn. Today, we'll be discussing the findings from his 6-month investigation, which you can hear laid out in full in his new podcast, Shandee's Story. We might start at the beginning. What happened to a woman named Shandee Blackburn in the early hours of February 9, 2013?
Yeah, it was about midnight, Jessie. She was walking home. She was less than 100 metres from her mother's house in Mackay. She had walked from a place called the Harrup Park Country Club, which is a very well-known restaurant and sporting facility in the centre of Mackay. And Shandee worked in the coffee shop there. She'd done the close, so that's why she was walking home late. It was February, it was still warm, and she'd sent a text message to her boyfriend Aaron telling him she'd finished. And as she turned into Boddington Street, which is where her mother lived, she's attacked, and her killer wields a knife, a really serious knife, with such powerful force that part of her scalp is sheared off. She has 23 knife wounds, and one of the knife wounds, police and the pathologist believe that it was one of the first inflicted, punctured her voice box, her larynx, which meant that she couldn't even cry out. She couldn't scream. She was coughing and then gurgling blood. The attack continued, and we believe we see her killer because he is crouching in bushes on the other side of the road near a Girl Guide's cottage, and he's there captured in CCTV footage taken by a camera on Juliet Street as Shandee walks along Juliet Street, oblivious to the fact that she's being stalked. And then we see this person running quickly across the road, across a paddock around where Shandee would have been. Now, we don't see the murder take place, and we only see the same person, the person we presume to be the killer, running back a short time after what we believe was the attack took place. Subsequently, there will be argument and legal debate in court about whether that person was in fact some random jogger or Shandee's killer. And I think most people taking a reasonable view about, people running around Mackay at a quarter past midnight would say, no, you don't crouch in bushes and run to where a woman is ultimately slain seconds later and then run back and not be connected. That is directly connected. She ends up falling to the bitumen and then crawling from the middle of the road to the gutter. She loses one of her false nails as she's trying to drag herself along the ground. And one of the residents of the townhouse nearby hears this coughing noise and rushes to her aid, and she's dying there. And you do hear some very harrowing audio in the podcast in episode 1 as a emergency responder is trying to help Ringo and others who are with Shandee before she's rushed to hospital. But by then it's too late. Her injuries are so severe. This knife attack was incredibly frenzied, and there was really little chance she was going to survive it.
Please talk to me. Tell me exactly what's happened with her.
Yeah, I'm right next to her now.
You are? Okay. How old is she? How old is she, sir?
Oh, man. She looks young.
Approximate age?
I'm going to just guess at 25 to 30. She ain't
All
moving.
right. Is she awake?
No.
Is she breathing, sir?
She don't look like she's breathing at all, man.
You say that the knife attack was particularly frenzied, and with crimes of this intensity and this targeted, police often assume that it's someone known to the victim. Was that their first line of inquiry, that the person who did this likely knew Shandee?
Jessie, you're absolutely right that is an early assumption of most detectives in a crime of this nature, where it appears to be what they describe as an emotional or particularly passionate personal attack. And what made this one, at least as far as the police were concerned, more personal was that a number of the knife strikes were directed at Shandee's face and her head. That's not usual, and I've seen studies, including one done by some researchers in Hong Kong, of attacks involving a knife. And when it's a stranger attacking the person, it's very, very rare, in fact, almost unheard of, for a stranger to attack the person in the face and the head with a knife. Those sorts of attacks are usually confined to people who are intimate or known well to the victim. But, of course, you can't rule out that it was an ice addict, that it was someone who had become completely unhinged with some serious mental health issue and was a stranger to the victim. So, I think the police always want to keep an open mind and not, shut down the alternative proposition. But in this case, because of the circumstances surrounding what they were hearing about the nature of the relationship, the failed relationship between Shandee and her former boyfriend, they very early in the piece started focusing on John Peros.
What kind of relationship did they have? That's obviously a major subject of the podcast, and that continues to unfold, what's discovered about what their relationship was like. But when they were together, what were they like together?
Yeah, I've talked to friends of John and Shandee who have described the relationship as being one of great passion and soaring love when things were going well. But it was always contaminated by these trust issues that John made no secret of. He was bedeviled by things that he believed Shandee would do to him. He believed that she would cheat on him. And because he had these underlying trust issues for some 20 years, long, long before he had met Shandee, they troubled him deeply. Shandee had made no secret of the fact that in a couple of relationships with former boyfriends, she hadn't been faithful. She'd cheated on one or two of those. And John believed that she would do that to him. And it really made him quite paranoid. And he says it himself in his own interviews with police. He just worried about that. And you can see it in the text messages that he doesn't trust her. And she's assuring him she's not that person anymore, that she loves him, she adores him. There's a 7-year age difference, and she really wants to make this thing work. And, she's not in the least bit interested in another guy or any other partners. She just wants John to be happy and to trust her, but he can't trust her. And this dynamic just infects their relationship, and it builds and builds. And whether that becomes a trigger for what happened, or whether someone else completely unrelated, killed Shandee, is something that, we are still closely investigating.
What caused the relationship to end ultimately, and who ended it?
John ended the relationship. He couldn't trust Shandee ultimately, and he wanted it over. Shandee left Mackay at that time to go and live on the Gold Coast. And, she says to John when she's on the plane, on the tarmac, ready to take off from Mackay Airport, that she loves him and this is so hard, but she's doing it for him. She's leaving her hometown to live on the Gold Coast. And you just wonder, why was she going? Was she going and saying that she was doing it for him because he was compelling her to go? He wanted her to go. He wanted her to be out of his life because he was so troubled by her presence, even if they were estranged. Or was she doing this voluntarily? Was she leaving because she wanted to start afresh in a new place and make new friends and try to put John and that relationship behind her? I don't know, but we do know John supported her financially after she made that move. He paid her $500 a week for a month until she could get some work. He paid for her flight to go to Mackay. So it's not as if when the relationship ultimately ended, he cut all ties. There was that financial assistance, but is that because it was his urging of her to go? And she'd said, well, if you want me to go so badly, you'd better, help me go because I can't afford to go. I don't know the truth. I think it's ambiguous, and we may never get to the bottom of why she really went. Shandee's family believes that John was so coercive that he effectively forced her to go. I think we just need to do a bit more work on that to really properly understand. But as I said, we might never know.
Mm. What did police think of him when they interviewed him? Were they suspicious? What was his demeanour?
I think they were suspicious because he was so very nervous in their first interview. And this comes out in one of the recorded comments made at that time. One of the police officers walks outside the interview room at Mackay Police Station and describes John, who he hasn't questioned prior to this occasion, and it's just 36 hours after Shandee's murder. He describes John as just being incredibly nervous, and his recording device picks up his description of John's anxiety and nervousness as he's telling another officer. Now, how much should we read into that? I think it's understandable that an ex-boyfriend of a woman who's just been stabbed to death would be nervous in an interview room with very skilled homicide detectives asking questions about the nature of the relationship. So, I don't want to suggest that because John appeared to be nervous, he must have seemed guilty to the officers. They're better trained than that, but it's a flag. The other things that concerned them early on were things like his refusal to give a voluntary sample of his DNA. as one of the detectives, Scott Furlong, said to me, you really start to look closely at someone who just flatly declines that request because you're trying to get to the bottom of who might have murdered an ex-girlfriend. And here you have, the former boyfriend saying, no, I'm not going to give you my DNA. That's it. As it turned out, the police actually recovered his DNA pretty promptly that day because John smoked a hand-rolled cigarette and he discarded the butt, and it was very carefully picked up by the police, unseen by John, and put in an evidence bag and sent off to the laboratory for testing.
Did he have an alibi for that night?
Well, no one could come forward on John's behalf to say where he was that night. And when John was asked by the police whether he went out where he was around the time Shandee was murdered, he didn't give a firm answer one way or the other. He left it hanging in that he said, I don't think I went out, or I don't think I went uptown. I think I stayed in. I might have. And so, again, police believe that you would know if you were out at midnight, which is when Shandee was killed, midnight, midnight. You would be able, the police believe, to remember if you had gone out driving or walking at that time just 36 hours earlier. So that was another red flag. And the police came to the view that the reason John didn't commit to one version or the other, that is, I was definitely in or I definitely went out, the reason he left that hanging was because in the police view, and this is, again, their view based on the fact they believe he killed Shandee, which he ultimately denied and adamantly and emphatically denied, but the police view was that he left that uncertain because it gave some wriggle room. If his vehicle were captured on CCTV or if a witness had seen him out after he had emphatically told the police he didn't go out, then he could be cornered in a lie and that would look really bad.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Jessie Stevens. I'm speaking with Gold Walkley-winning journalist Hedley Thomas about the harrowing cold case of Shandee Blackburn. There was CCTV footage from the scene. What did that pick up? It actually saw quite clearly a vehicle, didn't it?
Yes, and the vehicle has distinctive features which match the distinctive features on John's vehicle, but we don't see, for example, the number plate, the license plate. So it's frustrating in that you think you see John's vehicle driving near the murder scene and probably parking near the girl Guy's cottage from where the attack was launched, because that's where the running person is crouching in bushes. However, can you say with 100% certainty that's the vehicle that John Peros drives? Well, no, you couldn't actually get to that point. You could only say it has all these matching distinctive features, striping and decals and wheels and mags and same model, and even a very distinctive feature which was a rust spot in a particular place. But it doesn't make John a killer. It just means that he perhaps had forgotten that he had gone out driving. So what? That's what his lawyers would say. So what? Doesn't make him a killer. He hasn't been captured launching any attack.
Was John charged with murder?
John Peros was charged with murder in September 2014. So that's more than a year and a half after Shandee was killed. He then prepared for the inevitable murder trial, which would be another 2.5 years away. He had a very good defence team and they went to every length to do their job to defend him.
He was eventually acquitted of Shandee's murder. On what grounds was that acquittal?
Well, the jurors came to a verdict in less than 2 hours that John was not guilty. And for Shandee's family, it was a very distressing and sadly predictable outcome. And I say sadly predictable because they believed that the defence lawyering was so good and the amount of evidence that had been diminished or completely excluded. And bear in mind, this is all only circumstantial evidence. There are no witnesses making direct statements of, I saw John do this. I have some forensic DNA or blood evidence linking John to the crime scene. It was circumstantial based on the nature of the relationship, John's comments about Shandee to friends, the CCTV footage featuring the car that looked identical to his. But a lot of other evidence was excluded, including some of the messages, and I think that's why Shandee's mother, Vicky, was of the view that the jury reached the verdict that they did.
Can you give us a sense of what some of those messages said, what their correspondence was like?
Yeah, I think I can. And, when I read it, I found a lot of it really shocking. In fact, so shocking that when I asked one of my colleagues, Ellie, who is a young journalist for The Australian, to be a voice actor for Shandee, I had misgivings because I knew that some of the things that she would be replying to with these text messages were really cruel and coarse from John's side. So Shandee was taunted and bullied about having gained a little bit of weight. She wouldn't comply with some of John's sexual demands. She was constantly accused of being a slut and a whore and a hoe, and no matter how many times she tried to assure John that she just loved him and was only there for him, and she urged him to seek help for these trust issues that he freely acknowledged he had, these really serious problems with women. He just didn't cut her that slack, and I think that as a result, their exchanges were incredibly toxic. And Shandee wasn't always submissive either. I mean, she would fire back sometimes. She was an intelligent woman, witty, wickedly funny in some of her exchanges with friends, and she didn't take all of John's abuse without a response. But his jealousy issues were really overpowering, and I think a constant feature. And when you read this material, you just think, this is the other definition, in my view, of domestic violence. This is material that is sort of beyond the sometimes unkind things that partners and former partners say to each other. It's at another level. Shandee's sort of pleading with John to stop telling her life is worthless, to stop telling her that the best thing she can do is to kill herself. It's really quite sad as you sort of read it all. And we know about this material because it was recovered from Shandee's iPhone, which was dropped during the attack. She had it in her hand, probably her right hand, which the police believe was being restrained as she was being stabbed. If that iPhone had not been recovered by the police, we wouldn't have had such an incredible insight into that relationship and what was going on months before she was killed. And that's the other important point, Jesse, I want to make. In fairness to John, he appeared to stop replying to her in late May of 2012, and Shandee was murdered in February of 2013, about 4 months after she had returned to Mackay from the Gold Coast. That was a significant argument for the defence that these messages were effectively, ancient history, and for John, were not relevant anymore. He had moved on. The prosecution, of course, believed otherwise. So did the police.
John did see a psychologist for his trust issues and for some mental health issues he was experiencing. Were they able to subpoena what was discussed there and get a sense of, because those records are normally private, were they able to work out what John had said in some of those sessions with a psychologist?
Yes, the police worked out that John had been to see his GP, a psychologist, and 2 psychiatrists because of the mental health issues that he was experiencing, the distress that he was having shortly before and then after his breakup with Shandee in 2012. And the police wanted to know what John had disclosed in those sessions, because if, for example, he had talked to a psychologist or one of the 2 psychiatrists about an intent to harm or even kill Shandee or someone else, that would be relevant evidence. Now, most of us appreciate that our medical records, our mental health records are private and confidential. However, police can apply for a warrant from a magistrate to obtain that material because it might be relevant in a homicide investigation, and under certain circumstances a magistrate will grant that warrant, and that's what happened in this case. And the police were able to ascertain from that there were no indications by John to any of these practitioners of an intent to harm Shandee, but there were open disclosures by John about these very serious trust issues that he had. They haunted all of his relationships. He felt very troubled by these. He had a mild depression, some anxiety, and he just, I think, struggled with the idea of being able to find a woman in whom he would have complete trust.
There was eventually a coronial inquest into Shandee's death a few years later. What did that coroner determine?
The coroner held public hearings over a period in 2019, and these hearings included a number of witnesses who were interviewed by police but who didn't give evidence in the murder trial in 2017. For whatever reason, the prosecution didn't call them to give evidence. They were called by the coroner, and he went through a lot more evidence than the trial actually went through, including testimony by John, who was compelled to get in the witness box, which is not anything he could have been compelled to do in his murder trial. He stayed out of the witness box in the murder trial, but the coroner weighed all of the evidence, the testimony of John and others, and came to a conclusion in 2020, so last year, that he was very firmly, very confidently of the view that John Peros killed Shandee Blackburn that night in Mackay.
What would it take, if you have a coroner who's determined that, what would it take for John Peros to be convicted and incarcerated for that crime?
Queensland has law called double jeopardy. And what that means is that someone who has been put on trial and acquitted can't easily be prosecuted again for the same offence. And that's a reasonable position for prosecuting authorities and societies to have, because you can't have a situation where someone is constantly re-prosecuted having been acquitted. But under double jeopardy laws, there are exceptions to the rule, and you can be prosecuted again having been acquitted if there is compelling and new evidence. And that might be, for example, the discovery of a murder weapon with fingerprints or DNA on it, a confession made to a witness who comes forward and says, he told me he did it, and I recorded it, or I remember it as clear as day, and Jim was with me as well and he heard it. So something that, is pretty compelling and new that wasn't previously presented in the trial.
Finally, I wanted to ask, do you think it's possible to find enough fresh, compelling evidence to have John Perris convicted of this crime?
I'm being as careful as I can be, given the evidence, to not say whether or not, in our view, John killed Shandee. And so I'm certainly alive to the possibility that the coroner and his findings are incorrect. But I believe that this podcast series does have a really good chance of finding compelling new evidence against someone and hopefully allowing, the person who was responsible for Shandee's murder to be prosecuted and to be convicted and jailed for the rest of his life.
And for justice for Shandee's family, sister and mother, to have justice, because I can't imagine this many years later still not having someone behind bars for what they did to their sister and daughter.
Absolutely. And you have heard Shandee's mother, Vicky, being woken up at 4:30 in the morning and being told by the police, who have been banging on her front door, they've just walked down the road from where Shandee's blood is still in the gutter, and they've gone to tell Vicky that her youngest daughter has just been murdered. Can you imagine that? And Vicky, is a very stoic, she's a strong woman. She runs safety awareness campaigns for people, for particularly young women in Mackay. And every day she is haunted by what has happened. She wants to see justice. She hasn't had it. She's had 8 years since Shandee's murder, 2 processes, one being the criminal trial, which, as I mentioned, ended with a deliberation of less than 2 hours and a not guilty verdict. And then another process by another pillar of the system returning with a decision of emphatically, he's a killer, but he's not guilty of murder because he was already acquitted. So work that out.
Hedley Thomas is a Walkley Award-winning journalist with a reputation for incredible investigative work. He's been called a pioneer of podcasting, thanks to his 2 previous series, The Teacher's Pet and The Night Driver. And his latest, Shandee Story, continues his unique brand of masterful storytelling. Using raw audio from crime scenes, DNA experts and remarkable evidence, Hedley goes deep to find out who killed Shandee and why. The first episode of Shandee Story is available now for all listeners at shandee.com.au. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens, and produced by Gia Moylan. If you liked this episode, please leave us a review in your favourite podcast app. I'll be back next week with another episode, but in the meantime, if you'd like to hear more from me, you can find me on Mamamia Out Loud 3 times a week, as well as Cancelled, a comedy podcast about the stories of celebrity cancellations.